The wind scoured the plains like a blade, lifting the red dust in long, sorrowful ribbons that whispered against the bones of the land. The horizon was the color of rusted iron, endless and empty. At the edge of that desolation rode a man tall, spare, and silent, his hat brim pulled low against the glare. The horse beneath him was weary, ribs showing through its hide, hooves crunching over the brittle crust of frozen earth. He hadn't spoken in hours. There was no one to speak to. Samuel Creed had buried his brother 2 weeks ago, though time had lost its measure out here. The ranch, the Creed homestead, had once stretched proud across the valley, 100 head of cattle grazing under his father's watchful eye. Now, it was only Samuel and the ghosts. The wind kept them company, and the coyotes sang their hymns at night. The neighbors had stopped coming by, save for the preacher who'd said his condolences and gone quiet when Samuel refused to kneel. A man could feel God's silence as heavy as his word. Samuel felt it every morning, in the frost gathering on his breath and in the weight of his own heartbeat. The ranch was dying. The fences sagged, the roof leaked, and the well had begun to cough mud instead of water. He worked until his hands bled, but there were some things no man could mend alone. He saw her first as a shimmer against the heat, 3 figures trailing behind, small and slow. He thought at first they were strays, someone's cattle lost from the drive, but as they came closer, the shapes took form. A woman and 3 children walking the long road west, their clothes dust-caked, faces burned raw from the Sunday. He reined in the horse and waited. When they drew near enough, the eldest boy, no more than 12, lifted a stick as though it were a weapon. The girl clung to her mother's skirt. The smallest, a boy, still half a baby, rode on the woman's hip. She stopped a few paces off and lifted her chin. "We're looking for work," she said. Her voice cracked but didn't break. "A roof, if there's one to spare." Samuel studied her, the set of her shoulders, the hollows under her eyes. The widow's dress was faded and torn, the hem stiff with road dust. There was a wedding ring, dull as tarnished brass. "Ain't much here worth staying for," he said. "Then it's the same as anywhere else." Her answer came soft, but her gaze didn't falter. "We can cook, mend, clean. The boys can tend fences, haul water." Samuel hesitated. He had no reason to say yes, and no heart left to say no. "Suit yourself," he muttered. "Barn's got room enough." By dusk, the children were asleep in a pile of old hay, the woman sitting apart near the lantern. Samuel watched her from the doorway. She was mending a torn sleeve with thread drawn from her own hem, her hands trembling but steady in purpose. He'd seen that kind of strength before in soldiers who'd lost everything and still stood watch through the night. The town would talk. They already had plenty to say about the Creed Ranch and its cursed misfortune. A widowed woman living under a man's roof, folks would sneer before the first week was done. Samuel told himself he didn't care. Maybe he didn't. But as he lay in bed that night, staring at the rafters, he heard her quiet crying through the walls and felt something shift inside him. Not pity, something older, buried deep beneath the years of loss. Days passed, and the rhythm of the ranch began to breathe again. The widow, her name was Eliza, rose before dawn, lit the stove, and filled the house with the smell of bread and coffee. The boys followed Samuel to the fields, learning the ropes with wary diligence. They were small but willing, and Samuel found himself speaking more than he had in months short, gruff words, but words nonetheless. Eliza didn't ask questions about his past, and he didn't ask about hers. The silence between them became its own language, measured in the sound of work pails clanking at the well, boots scraping against dry boards, the sigh of wind through open windows. Sometimes, when she thought no one watched, Eliza would stand by the porch at sunset, her face turned toward the dying light, a kind of longing written there that Samuel couldn't name. The neighbors began to notice. At the mercantile, men snickered behind their beards. "Creed's found himself a new kind of hand," one said. "Bet she don't work for free." Samuel let them laugh. He'd known cruelty like that his whole life. It was the currency of lonely men. But when Eliza heard, he saw the hurt in her eyes, quick as a blade before she looked away. That night, Samuel found her mending a boot by the fire. "You ain't got to mind what they say," he told her. She didn't look up. "I've heard worse." He stood there a long moment, the words caught in his throat. The fire popped, throwing light across her face. "You're doing fine work," he said at last. Her hands stilled, and something softened in her expression. "So are you, Mr. Creed." Outside, the wind quieted for the first time in months, and the house felt almost like home again. Morning came pale and brittle, the kind of light that made the world seem carved from bone. Frost edged the pump handle, and his palm stuck to the iron as he worked it up and down, water coughing thin as a sick child. Breath hung from him in rags. In the yard, the boys stood with their hands jammed in their pockets, waiting for a task. The girl pressed her face to the kitchen window, fogging the glass with slow circles of breath. Inside, the stove ticked and sighed. He could feel the warmth of it from the porch like a hand against his cheek. Work arranged itself without talk. He set the eldest to checking fence posts on the ridge. He gave the smaller boy a rake and a soft word about the yard, the way burrs lay like thorns in sleep and would wake in the hooves if left. He carried a sack of cracked corn to the chicken run and found the girl already there, scattering feed with a solemn care, her dress too thin to keep the wind from her bones. She did not see him watching. She made a small sound, a hush, as the hens came on in their rustling hurry, and that single word held a tenderness that pricked him like a nettle. He remembered his mother in the wash-house, steam ghosting the rafters, her wrists reddened from winter water. He remembered the way she would pause and lay a wet hand against his hair, smoothing it down as if she could iron the wildness from him. Then the image slid like a shutter and left only the ache of it. He shook the corn from his fingers and turned back toward the barn. The woman had taken the tack room for her mending. He found her on a wooden crate, a blanket over her knees, needle flashing. She had scoured the floor, stacked the oil cans, folded the old saddle blankets into neat square promises. Order hung around her like a scent. He felt ungainly in its presence, a man grown used to clutter and the slow rot of neglect. She glanced up, then down again, and he saw it. A tremor caught and steadied, as if she drove a stake through the vibration of her own fear. In the afternoons he put her on the bay mare. She sat stiff as a nailed board at first, hands locked, eyes fixed to the middle distance. He led the mare by the halter, speaking to the horse under his breath, words that weren't words so much as a cadence. The youngest rode in front of her, his fists knotted in the mane, squealing when the mare shivered skin against a fly. Day by day she loosened, the lines of her shoulders easing, the mare's footfalls becoming a rhythm that stitched her to the land one quiet step at a time. He did not tell her she was learning. He only circled the yard wider, gave her the reins, then nothing. When she guided the bay through the gate and across the stubbled field on her own, he looked away so she would not see him smile. At the store they did not stop their talk. Men leaned against barrels, boots crossed, faces cut from the same long scrap of smugness. He heard them without listening. A woman, though, spoke within reach of the flour sacks, her voice pitched to carry. Said a widow with 3 mouths could sniff a weak man like a coyote scenting offal. He felt the words, land, dull and cold, like clods on a coffin lid. He paid for nails and salt and coffee ground rough, then stepped out to the hitch rail where the eldest boy stood waiting with the mule. The boy looked up, searching his face for weather, found it unreadable, and nodded like a man who had learned early that storms were for bearing, not for naming. That night he fixed the leak over the kitchen, tar bucket swaying on the ladder rung. Through the open trap he heard the woman humming, not a song he knew, just a thread of sound that made the work easier. Though the tar stung his nose and the roof boards flexed under his knees, he set his palm flat on the pitch and felt the faint warmth stored from the day. A memory came again of his father walking the same boards, a hammer at his belt, cussing the sky with a strange love. He blinked it back. The past had a way of standing in doorways, hat in hand, waiting to be asked in. When the snow blew thin one evening like sifted flour, he found the boys in the barn trying to wrap twine around a split handle. He took the shovel, set the wood against his boot, and showed them how to shave the break clean with a drawing knife, how to fit the new splice snug, how to bind the seam with a strip of wet rawhide that would harden and hold. The lesson wasn't in the tool. It was in the patience he kept in his voice when the younger fumbled, in the way he handed the knife back without comment. Later, by lamplight, he watched the woman take a thorn from the girl's heel with a thread and a needle, and the same steady patience. They did not speak of it, but the house collected such moments the way a field collects snow, each flake small, the drift inevitable. He learned things without asking. The way her jaw tightened when thunder muttered far off, as if storms had once arrived with boots and slammed doors. The way she counted silently at night, lips barely moving, as though she marked exhaustion like a tally, one line after another until sleep erased the slate. The way she touched the lintel each morning with her fingertips. Not a prayer, not exactly, but a request. One dawn the pump went dry. It gave one last shudder and quit, the handle falling with a dead clank. He felt the old panic flare, quick as fire in paper. He pulled the cover from the wellhead and peered into the dark. Mud, stink rose. He could hear men laughing in his memory, saying the Creed place was done for good. He started toward the barn to fetch the rope and buckets, to lower himself down into that black throat, when her voice came from behind him. "There is a second well," she said. The words were plain, almost careless. He turned. She stood with her shawl slung around her shoulders, frost on the fringe. "Under the cottonwoods by the old stone wall," she said, "I found a ring of boards sunk into the grass, where the ground keeps green." He stared at her, then at the wall, a place he had passed 100 times with his eyes on the horizon and not the earth. He felt foolish and grateful at once, a bitter and a sweet he could not separate. He nodded. "Come on," he said, "we will see." The ground near the stone wall was soft with moss, even in the freeze. Samuel knelt, brushed away the leaves, and there it was, the outline of an old cover, half rotted through, the iron ring rusted but true. He felt the breath catch in his throat. His father had spoken once of a spring that ran beneath the ridge, but he'd never found it, never needed to while the main well held. Now, with his palms pressed to the earth, Samuel felt the faint hum of water moving somewhere deep below, patient and alive. Eliza crouched beside him, her skirt gathering the dew. "It's older than the house," she said. "Someone dug this before the Creeds came west." He looked at her, the way her breath came in small white clouds, the way her fingers traced the worn grain of the wood. "You sure it's clean?" She gave a small smile, tired but certain. "You can tell by the moss, green, that deep in winter means it's fed, not standing." He pried up the cover with a crowbar. The hinges gave like old bones, and a cold scent rose stone, iron, the faint sweetness of hidden things. The boy fetched a rope and pail, and Samuel lowered it slow. When he hauled it up, the water gleamed like quicksilver. He cupped a handful and drank. It was clear and cold, and it tasted like mercy. That night, he didn't say grace, but when Eliza set the bread on the table, the air felt changed. The ranch breathed easier. The horses drank deep, the troughs filled, and the silence that had weighed on the place seemed to ease its grip. Word spread fast, as it always did. By the week's end, 2 neighbors had come to see the miracle, each with their mouths set in a way that said they didn't much like being wrong. One of them, Jesse Hall, spat into the dirt and said, "Guess the widow's good for something after all." His tone held a grin that made Samuel's hands twitch at his sides. But Eliza said nothing. She only looked past them, out to where the cottonwoods bent in the wind. After they left, Samuel spoke low. "You don't have to stand there talk." She tied her shawl tighter. "They'll talk no matter how straight I stand." He opened his mouth, closed it again. There was no arguing that kind of truth. Days rolled into each other like cattle in a storm. The well became their center. Eliza built a small fence around it, laid stones to mark the edge, and taught the children to draw water with care. The girl hummed as she worked, the tune light as smoke. The house smelled of stew and saddle soap, of sweat and something tender that Samuel didn't dare name. But peace is a fragile thing. On the frontier it cracks easy, like ice underfoot. It started with a letter. The postwriter brought it up the valley, his horse panting. Samuel met him at the gate. The envelope bore no name, just a county seal. Inside, the words were short and sharp. Foreclosure proceedings on the Creed Ranch pending. The bank in town had grown tired of waiting. He read it twice, then folded it cleanly and slid it into his coat. That night he sat long after the lamps were out, the paper lying between his hands. He'd borrowed money 2 winters ago after his brother's death to feed the cattle. to mend what could still be mended. The drought had stolen the rest. Eliza came in quiet, her face pale in the firelight. "Something's wrong," she said, not asking. He nodded, still staring at the flames. "They mean to take it." For a long moment she said nothing. Then, "How much do you owe?" "Too much." He gave a bitter laugh. "No man pays debt with ghosts." Her hands clenched the edge of the table. "Maybe not with ghosts, but with work." He looked at her then, really looked, the firm set of her jaw, the light in her eyes that burned steady even when fear brushed close. "You already work more than any of us." "I mean trade," she said. "In town. Sewing, washing, mending. Folks may talk, but they still need their shirts whole." He started to protest, but she held his gaze. "Let me help, Samuel. You took us in when no one would. Let me pay what we owe." He wanted to refuse. Pride rose like a wall between them, but the truth was heavier. He gave a single nod. By week's end, she was walking the long road into town each morning, a bundle of cloth over her arm, her children trailing behind like ducklings. She came back after dark, hands cracked, face windburned, but her eyes held a stubborn gleam. Coins clinked in a small tin she kept beneath the stove. He never asked how much. It wasn't about the counting, it was about the doing. The townsfolk changed their tones soon enough. Whispers turned to praise wrapped in surprise. "That widow," they said, "got more grit than most men I know." But not everyone was kind. Jesse Hall came one evening, drunk and smiling wide, leaning against the porch post. "Word is," he said, "you're letting her pay your debts for you. A fine arrangement, Creed." Samuel's jaw tightened. "You best be on your way." Jesse laughed, mean and low. "Guess a man'll sell more than his pride when he's broke." The blow came fast. Jesse hit the dust before his grin could fade. Samuel's fist throbbed. The world spun with the sound of his own breath. Eliza stood in the doorway, her eyes wide not with fear, but something like sorrow. Jesse spat blood and staggered off, cursing into the dark. The porch was quiet again, save for the hiss of the lantern. She spoke first. "You didn't have to." "Yes, I did." He turned to leave, but she said softly, "They'll make it harder now." "I'll take harder," he said, "if it means they know to keep their distance." For a moment, they stood like that, two shadows against the weak light. Then she reached out and touched his arm, barely. "You're a good man, Samuel Creed." He wanted to answer, but his throat closed around the words. Outside, the stars burned cold and clear above the valley, and though the night stretched endless, it felt for the first time in a long while like the beginning of something that might yet endure. Winter deepened, laying its hand over the valley until even the air seemed made of glass. The mornings came slow and white, the frost clinging thick to the porch rail, the creek sheathed in ice that moaned when the sun touched it. Inside the house, firelight drew small circles of warmth in the gloom. The youngest boy slept with the dog near the hearth. Eliza's needle moved in the lamplight, a rhythm as steady as breathing. Samuel watched her sometimes. From the doorway, or while pretending to mend tack, watched the line of her shoulders, the curve of her neck bent toward the thread. He found himself listening for her voice now, the quiet cadence of it when she spoke to the children, the way it softened the edges of a hard day. Once, coming in from the cold, he heard her singing under her breath a hymn, older than either of them. He stopped just outside the door, not wanting to break it. The sound wove through the air like smoke, carrying something of home, or the memory of one. For the first time in years, Samuel felt the ache ease in his chest. The ranch held steady through January. The cattle, thin but living, found feed where he spread it. The new well ran strong. At night he and the boys mended harness by the fire. He taught them knots, taught them the patience of leather work. The eldest, Luke, took to it quick, his hands steady, his eyes serious. The girl, Anna, learned to bake bread that rose right, proud as a cloud. The little one toddled through it all, a blur of laughter and dirt. There were evenings when the world seemed almost kind, snow whispering against the windows, the warmth of stew on the table, the smell of pine from the woodpile. Eliza's hair had come loose from its braid. She'd brush it back absently while she worked. Samuel found himself wanting to reach over, to touch that strand, to feel the life in it, but he didn't. He'd lost too much already to trust what hope offered. Then came the thaw, and with it, the trouble. A rider from town brought word that the bank had refused another extension. The ranch would be auctioned come spring, unless the debt was cleared. Samuel folded the paper slow, said nothing. Eliza saw the color drain from his face and took the letter from his hands. She read it once, twice, her mouth tightening. "There's still time," she said. He shook his head. "Not enough. Then we'll make enough." Her certainty stirred something in him both fierce and painful. "Eliza," he said, "I won't have you begging work from men who sneer at you." She set the letter on the table and looked him square in the eye. "You took us in when no one would. You think I'd stop now because some fool can't hold his tongue?" He had no words for that kind of courage, only a nod. She began sewing for every household within 10 miles, patching, stitching, repairing coats worn thin by the cold. The children helped where they could. Samuel hauled her bundles to town, waited by the wagon while she made her rounds. Folks had learned better than to mock her now. Some even pressed extra coins into her palm, quiet, respectful. Still, it wasn't enough. The night they came for the cattle, the moon was a pale coin hung over the ridge. Samuel woke to the low thunder of hooves and the sharp crack of a gate. He was out of bed before thought caught up, rifle in hand. The thieves, 3 of them, were already driving the herd toward the flats. He fired once into the air. They turned. One shot back, wild but close. Eliza was suddenly there beside him, a lantern in her grip, her hair loose and wild. "Samuel, don't—" But he was already running. The ground was slick, the wind full of dust and snow. He caught up near the lower pasture, shouting, but they didn't stop. The next shot took his hat clean off. He dropped to a knee, steadied his breath, and fired once. A horse screamed, stumbled, and went down. The others turned tail into the dark. When he reached the fallen rider, the man was clutching his shoulder, blood dark against his coat. "Haul," Samuel muttered. Jesse's grin was gone. In its place was a grimace of pain. "You'll hang for this," Jesse hissed. "You came stealing from my land," Samuel said. "You hang yourself." He slung the man across the wagon and hauled him to town come morning, left him at the sheriff's with no more words. The town's talk turned quick after that. Some called Samuel a hero. Others said he'd gone too far. Eliza stayed silent, her hands folded in her lap when he told her. But that night, when the house had gone still, she reached across the table and took his hand. Her touch was light, trembling, but sure. "You did what you had to," she said. He met her gaze, saw the truth there, raw, unflinching. "Maybe, but it cost more than it's worth." She shook her head. "You've kept this place alive. That's worth something." They sat like that a long while, the fire burning low. Outside, the thawing snow dripped from the eaves like a clock counting down. When she finally rose to leave, she paused at the door. "Samuel," she said softly, "if they take this land, they can't take what we built here, not what's been mended." He wanted to tell her he believed her, that he'd give up every acre if it meant keeping that light in her eyes. But words, he'd learned, were the weakest kind of promise. So instead he stood, took his hat, and went out into the night to check the fences, the stars sharp as nails overhead, his breath turning to fog in the cold. He didn't see her watching from the window. Her hand pressed to the glass, her face lit by a single fragile flame. The thaw came fully in March, and with it the mud deep, sucking, relentless. Hooves sank to the fetlock, wagons mired in the ruts. The ranch smelled of wet earth and animal sweat, of things coming back to life. Samuel rose before dawn each morning to haul hay from the loft, his shoulders aching with a dull good pain. The boys worked beside him now without complaint. Luke had grown tall enough to shoulder the harness alone, and Samuel found himself thinking of the word son before he caught it back. Eliza moved through the days with a kind of quiet fire. She mended, cooked, washed, and still found time to tend the new lambs, their bleats soft and uncertain. Sometimes, when the light broke just right, he'd see her standing in the yard with her skirts pinned up, her hands sunk in the earth as she planted a row of beans. Her hair had gone gold at the edges where the sun had kissed it. There was a steadiness to her like a tree that bends but never breaks. By April, the letters from the bank had grown colder, sharper. The deadline for payment stood fixed as a hanging date. Samuel counted the coins on the table one evening, the lamplight glinting off each worn piece. It wasn't enough. Not near. He stared at them until they blurred, until the sound of the fire filled the silence with its small, mocking laughter. Eliza watched him from across the table. "There's one thing left," she said. He lifted his head. "What's that?" "The horse. The bay mare. She's worth something in town." Samuel stiffened. "That horse is the last bloodline from my father's herd." She met his gaze without flinching. "And he'd rather see his son keep his home than polish a memory." He said nothing for a long time. Then he rose, went to the window, and looked out at the yard. The mare stood near the fence, head bowed, the moonlight tracing her back in silver. He could still remember breaking her to saddle, the fight and the trust that had followed. Some things you don't trade, he thought. But he also saw the children asleep by the hearth, the faint smile on Eliza's lips as she waited for his answer. Come morning, he saddled the mare and rode into town. The trail was soft under hoof, the air heavy with the smell of thawing sage. When he reached the livery, he stood there longer than he meant to, one hand on the reins. The trader, a squat man named Whittle, squinted at the horse and gave a low whistle. Fine animal. Shame to part with her. Samuel nodded once. How much? Whittle rubbed his chin. Not what she's worth, but times are lean. $40. Samuel didn't blink. 50, and you'll have her bridle too. The man shrugged. 50 then. Samuel watched the mare's ears flick as she was led away. She turned her head once, as if searching for him. He looked down until the sound of her hooves faded. When he walked out of town, his hands felt empty, in a way money could not fill. That night, when he laid the coins on the table, Eliza reached across and covered his hand with hers. Thank you, she said, simple and full. He tried to smile, but it came out crooked. Don't thank me, he muttered. A man shouldn't have to sell his own heart to keep a roof overhead. She squeezed his fingers. Sometimes that's the price of beginning again. The next days were a flurry of work repairs, counting stock, mending fences. The ranch began to breathe like something waking from a long sickness. Samuel caught himself whistling once, and the sound startled him so much he stopped mid-note. But it was there, the faint taste of hope, stubborn and wild. Then, on a bright morning that smelled of rain, the sheriff rode up the lane. His hat was low, his face unreadable. Samuel wiped his hands on his trousers and went to meet him. Creed, the sheriff said, dismounting slow. I've come about the debt. Samuel's stomach tightened. You'll get your money soon. That's the thing, the sheriff said. The bank's ledger shows it cleared yesterday. Samuel frowned. That can't be. I haven't sent payment. The sheriff pulled a folded paper from his coat. Wasn't from you? Came in through the post, marked anonymous. Eliza had come to the door, her apron still dusted with flour. Samuel looked at her, questions crowding his throat, but her face gave nothing away, only calm, and that same quiet strength he had come to depend on. After the sheriff rode off, he turned to her. What did you do? She dried her hands on her apron, eyes steady. I wrote to my late husband's family. They owed me nothing, but I asked anyway. Samuel felt the ground shift beneath him. You shouldn't have had to. No, she said softly, but I did. Because this place is worth it. Because you are. The words hit him harder than any bullet could. He wanted to speak, to tell her what it meant, but all he managed was a rough whisper. Eliza, she smiled faintly, the kind that comes from deep inside, where weariness and grace meet. It's done now, Samuel. The ranch is yours. He stepped toward her, slow, like a man approaching a skittish horse. Ours, he said finally. The ranch is ours. For a long heartbeat, the world held still. The wind moved through the cottonwoods like a sigh. Then she nodded, just once, and something in both of them eased. That night, the house glowed with lamplight and laughter. The children sang an off-key tune while Eliza stirred the pot. Samuel sat at the table, the warmth on his face, and truly felt for the first time in years that he was no longer alone. Outside, spring rain began to fall, soft and sure, soaking into the thirsty earth. The rain did not stop for 3 days. It came steady and patient, drumming on the tin roof like the heartbeat of the land itself. Puddles gathered in the yard. The creek, once a dry whisper, turned to a brown surge that licked at the banks and carried the winter's dust away. The world smelled of wet sage and promise. On the morning the sun returned, the valley shimmered. The cottonwoods stood rinsed in silver. The air was soft enough to breathe without ache. Samuel stepped onto the porch and looked out over the fields. The grass had begun to show through thin green blades trembling in the light. He could feel it in his bones, the beginning of the ranch's return. Eliza joined him, her shawl loose around her shoulders. Her hair was damp from the steam of morning chores, strands curling against her temple. She followed his gaze to the pasture. The smallest boy was chasing a chicken, laughing so hard he could barely stand. Luke and Anna were hauling feed buckets, their boots sinking in the mud. "They've found their place," she said quietly. Samuel nodded. "So have you." She gave him a sidelong look, not shy, but uncertain. "You make it sound easy." It wasn't. He smiled then, small, tired, but real. "Nothing worth holding ever is." For a while they stood without talking, the kind of silence that feels full rather than empty. Then she turned, studying him. "You could rebuild it, you know. The herd, the barn, everything your father had here." He rubbed a hand over his jaw. "Maybe. But I'd rather build something new." Her eyes softened. "Then you already have." It was that night, as they sat by the fire, that the storm returned not from the sky but from the past. A wagon rattled up the lane. Samuel opened the door to find a man standing in the wet yard, hat in hand, rain dripping from his coat. His eyes were pale, restless. "Name's Edwin Brandt," he said. "Eliza's my sister-in-law." Samuel felt the air tighten. Eliza came to the doorway, her face gone still. "Edwin," she said, "you shouldn't have come." The man stepped closer. "You wrote about money owed, and I paid it. But I didn't think that bought you the right to live under another man's roof." Samuel's voice was quiet, dangerous in its calm. "You got something to say. Best say it plain." Edwin's eyes slid toward Eliza. "She's got family back east. The children got kin who can raise them proper. You think you can give them better than that, Creed?" Eliza flinched as if struck. "You have no right," she said. "You never did." Samuel's hand clenched at his side. "You come to take her?" "I came to remind her where she belongs." The words hung in the rain-heavy air. Then Eliza stepped forward, chin high. "I belong where I am wanted, where my work means something, where my children can grow without fear." Her voice trembled only once. "And that's here." Edwin's face hardened. "You'll regret this." "No," she said, and turned away from him. Samuel took one step down from the porch. "You best be on your way, Mr. Brandt." For a moment it seemed the man might argue. Then he saw something in Samuel's eyes, something that promised finality. He spat into the mud, climbed onto his wagon, and rode off without another word. When the sound of wheels had faded, Eliza sank onto the steps, her hands shaking. Samuel crouched beside her. "You all right?" She nodded, but tears streaked her cheeks, unhidden and unashamed. "I didn't know he'd come. I thought after my husband died they'd be glad to forget us." He laid a rough hand over hers. "Let 'em. You've made your own place now." The fire inside the house crackled, throwing orange light out the open door. The air between them was thick with rain and memory. He felt her fingers tighten around his, felt the pulse there alive, fragile, defiant. After a while, she spoke again. "You think the town will ever stop talking?" He looked toward the rain and the dark horizon, where the clouds were breaking apart. "Let 'em talk. The land remembers truth better than people do." She smiled then, faint but real. "You sound like an old preacher." He gave a quiet laugh. "Only ever learned one sermon. Work hard, keep faith, and don't let the fire go out." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "Then keep preaching." They sat like that until the stars came out slow and cautious, like a promise finally kept. In the days that followed, the valley bloomed. The cattle grew fat again. The fields turned green. Samuel built a new fence along the east ridge, with Luke at his side and the younger boy handing nails from a bucket too big for his arms. Eliza tended a garden by the porch. She hummed as she worked, the tune carrying out across the pasture. By midsummer, the ranch no longer looked like a place haunted by loss. It looked like something alive, mended, and true. That evening, Samuel brought a small box from his room. He placed it on the table before her. Inside, wrapped in cloth, lay his mother's ring, silver worn thin with years. "I reckon it should belong to someone who saved more than a ranch," he said. Eliza stared at it, then at him. The lamplight caught the shine of her tears. "Samuel," she whispered, "you don't have to." "I know," he said. "That's why I mean it." She lifted the ring, turning it in her fingers. The children, sleepy from the day's work, leaned against the doorway, watching without understanding, but feeling the weight of the moment. Eliza slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit as though it had been waiting for her all along. Outside, the wind carried the scent of rain and grass. The stars hung steady above the valley. In that quiet, something sacred took root, not the loud kind of love, but the kind that endures, the kind that builds a life from the ruin of what once was. And when Samuel reached across the table to take her hand, it was not a beginning or an end, but a promise to keep walking the same road, side by side, through whatever the horizon would bring. The ranch would stand, the land would remember, and in the soft hum of crickets and the long breath of the plains, their story would settle into the earth like seed.